Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a new podcast, which is called the 286 Project. My name is Chris Akers, and every week I'm going to be interviewing people from art, politics, sports, culture, and anything else we can think of. Today's guest, I've actually known her for about a decade, believe it or not. And the first time we met, there was where I was living at the time, there was a pub about 10 minutes down the road, and she did a presentation at on this pub, which was about biometrics in schools. And I obviously knew about biometrics, what it meant, but I didn't understand how it was infiltrated in schools because it wasn't around really in my day. And what I heard really startled me, to say the least, from her own personal journey to what she's researched and what she's been fighting for, etc. So her name is Pippa King, and I'd like to introduce her to the podcast. Hi, Pippa.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. So, as I said there, about 10 years ago, we first met, and you did a presentation on biometrics in schools, and it was a real eye-opener in the sense of how, yes, I knew about biometrics, but the ways in which it was used, and especially your own story. So can we just start like every journey, start at the beginning? How did you get to campaign against biometrics in schools? What led you to that journey?
So this was back in 2005. I had two small children, aged 6 and 7, and they were at a primary school that had a primary school of about 160 kids in. And it was just one of those coincidental events where, literally a couple of weeks earlier, I was on the internet and I was reading an article about how schools were introducing fingerprint scanners for children to get books out of libraries. And they were about the size of a credit card. And I just read the article and thought, crikey, that's complete overkill. Because at that time, in 2005, there were no biometrics in society. We weren't using our face or fingerprints to unlock smartphones. That technology wasn't around. We certainly weren't using biometrics for banking or for anything else like that. It was a completely new technology. And of course, we had Tony Blair in power at the time that was looking to introduce sort of biometric ID for the adult population, of which there was a big kickback against. And I just thought, why on earth are they fingerprinting my 6 and 7-year-old just to get a library book out? And or why were they using that in schools? But anyway, I was a member of the Parent Teachers Association. I can remember walking into the school library, I think it was doing something for the summer fair, and I spotted the same credit card size scanner in the school library. And I just thought, wow, how come we've got one of those? And so I obviously said to the head teacher, I'm not happy at all about my children's fingerprints being taken just so they can get a library book out. I said, I'm dreaming you're asking permission for it. I mean, have you taken my kids' fingerprints? Because I haven't seen a permission slip. And, if any parent has kids at school, you'll know that, you have to sign permission slips for virtually everything, tasting food, school trips, going swimming, all sorts of different things. So I was surprised I hadn't seen a consent slip for this. And she just sort of looked me square in the face and said, well, I don't need your permission to take the fingerprints because, it's not, I don't have to. So it's like, crikey, so I left school that evening and went and had a look at the Data Protection Act. And all parents are data subjects in effect. So we have data controllers and data subjects. And data controllers are things like organizations, teachers, somebody who holds your data, and you're a data subject. And until a child is 16, the parent is the data subject, which is why they have to ask our permission for things in schools. And when you want to process special category data, which is religious beliefs, criminal records, etc., and then you have to gain specific consent. And because biometrics weren't included in that particular Data Protection Act, which I think was from 1998 or 99, because biometrics weren't in society, didn't need to be put in the Act. Of course, it slipped through that particular bit of legislation, which ensured that the head teacher didn't have to ask for permission to take fingerprints. So, I mean, my first initial thought was, well, we need to we need to amend the Data Protection Act to put biometrics in there. But obviously, my knowledge on this was completely at zero. I mean, I teach music for a living. I have no sort of special knowledge on biometrics or data protection, but I was just incensed that they were sort of conditioning my kids to think it was okay that in order for you to read a book, you need to give us your fingerprint. And of course, this technology has expanded now to registration, access to areas, canteen usage. And so, you know, for two young children at 6 and 7 years old, it was just wrong. It didn't feel right to me. So that evening, I actually went home, and rather than write to local authority or make an official complaint to school, I just wrote straight to the parliamentary ministers. I wrote to who was then the shadow Secretary of State for Education, which was David Cameron. I wrote to the Tony Blair government, and just because there's been no discussion about this in Parliament, you can easily do that by looking through Hansard on the internet. And when I Googled it, there was absolutely nothing on the internet about kids using their fingerprints in schools. So what I managed to do is eventually go back to the original article that I read, so in my browsing history, and got in touch with the person who'd written that. And it was a very small, literally one-woman organisation called Action on Rights to Children, and a brilliant woman called Terry Doughty, who was running that as a mum. And I got in touch with her and said, you know, this is happening in my kid's school. How can I stop it? And she said, oh, I've had about 3 or 4 other parents around the UK, because it was just emerging at that time, that have got similar sentiments to you. So shall we sort of work together and try and see if we can get some parliamentary questions, and maybe try and see how we can go about amending the Data Protection Act, so at least, well, in my opinion, the technology shouldn't be in schools, but, you know, at least compel schools to ask for permission from parents. And so I ended up not organising, because there was a group of maybe 5 to 8 parents. We sort of organised ourselves into a communications we had an email communications, because again, there was no WhatsApp, you couldn't do what we're doing and doing Zoom, you know, everything was by email or by telephone call, nearly 20 years ago now. And so what Terry Doughty enabled us to do was to collect our concerns together and present them to organisations like No to ID, Privacy International, Liberty herself, and they then have access to members of Parliament, which can ask questions to the Department of Education, etc. And so we started asking some questions, and it was complete news to the ministers that this technology was in schools. And I know David Cameron wrote back or emailed back and said, I'm considering this a Home Office security problem. And he then sort of referred the matter on to David Davis, who was Shadow Minister for the Home Office, I think, at the time, or certainly worked for the Shadow Home Office Department. And they were obviously concerned about it, because it was, you know, you're taking the next generation's fingerprints. But the interesting thing about this posse of parents that we had was that at least half of them were from the tech industry, and they were concerned because, you know, if you're going to test, essentially, which is what Britain did, a technology like biometrics on certain part of the population, you wouldn't do it with 6 and 7-year-olds, primary school kids, because that data has to be completely secure for the next 6, 7 decades. If you really wanted to do it, you would be maybe doing it on old age pensioners' bus passes or something like that, so just to test if it worked. Because there was no other country in the world that was using this technology. So, you know, we were the first ones to use it. And so we got some questions asked in Parliament, and the bland answer from the then Blair government was, well, schools aren't breaking the Data Protection Act, you know, which there wasn't a Data Protection Act clause to break. And we sort of got this nonsensical answer consistently from any questions that we asked. And the Lib Dems and the Conservatives opposition at the time were very good. And we got a host of questions asked: how many schools were doing it, what biometric technology was being used in schools, what was it being used for. Of course, the Department of Education had no idea at all. And so we continued to put the pressure on. And I think in 2005 or 2006, I thought, well, there's nothing like this happening anywhere else in the world. It's obviously happening in the UK. I'll set up a blog and start writing about the journey that, you know, this little band of parents and myself were going on. And so I set it up. It's pippaking.blogspot.com, and it's just called Biometrics in Schools. And I've still got the Blogspot website going. It's got over, I think, 100,000 words that I've written on it, loads and loads of links. And it was certainly really useful to the then Department of Education, because we'd get a question asked in Parliament, and then I could see from the stats on my blog that Department of Education had hit my blog to get the answer to it quite often, which was funny. So anyway, so we were sort of hitting a brick wall, but it's interesting because within that time, from 2005 to 2010, when the coalition Conservative Liberal Democrat government got in, we had mainly fingerprinting in schools, but we had also in Scotland trialled infrared palm scanning, facial recognition as well. Those two particular technologies weren't fit for purpose and were only run for a few terms. We also had iris scanning in Northumberland. So the biometrics industry was sort of, because of this lack of clarification in the Data Protection Act, it's sort of seen the UK school market as a great place to essentially do research and development with biometrics. You know, can we use them for door access? Can we use them for lockers? Can we use them for vending machines? Which apparently all work, which is happening now. And it's sort of plumped for, mainly it was happening in primary schools with library systems, and then it sort of progressed into secondary schools, and the library primary school market sort of stopped working because I think the industry clicked that mums chatting in the playground about this wasn't good. So the technology sort of naturally found its way out of primary schools and into secondary. We have not got that parental communication going on. And of course, kids go to a new school, it's called technology by sort of 2010. And they would just, you know, put your fingerprint on a scanner, your finger on a scanner. And of course, you know, children in a compliant situation, what do they know about biometrics and potential implications of where could that information go? Could it go to Interpol? You know, different lettered agencies across the world. And who knows what sort of implications that's going to have for years to come on them. So anyway, in 2010, we had a change of political governance, and Labour were voted out, and we got the coalition of Conservative and Liberal Democrat parties. And to be fair, the ministers had always said, you know, if we get into power, we'll address this issue of schools using biometrics, and they did. There was a sort of an act of Parliament called the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012, and in Chapter 2, we've got 4 clauses in there which were and are the first country-led legislation on the use of children's consent to biometrics in schools. And it's the strongest sort of consent legislation there is, because you have to get, essentially schools have to gain consent from both parents. If one parent says, yeah, it's fine, I consent, and the other parent doesn't consent, the non-consent overrides the consent. And interestingly enough, if both parents consent and the child doesn't consent, no matter how old the child is, whether they be 4 years old or 16 years old, if they don't want to put their fingerprints onto a system, their non-consent overrides their parents' consent, which is completely unusual and fantastic. I mean, in my eyes, the technology shouldn't be in schools anyway, just because you don't need to give up your biometrics in order to access food or library books or have registration. You know, you've got chip and pin, you've got other different ways of doing it, which is far more less data intrusive, which is now what the Data Protection Act and GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, the European ones, state. But yet we still have biometrics in schools. And so schools now have to ask for consent. Unfortunately, that only applies to England and Wales. It doesn't apply to Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we're sort of working on getting that bit of the Protection of Freedoms Act to apply to Scotland and Northern Ireland, but things have sort of, since 2010 or 2012 when the law was enacted, we've had a sort of progression of use fingerprints in schools, and myself and another organisation called Defend Digital Me did a report last year, sort of 10 years on from the Protection of Freedoms Act, to look at the use of biometrics in schools. And we found that across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, that if you're at a secondary school, state secondary school, the likelihood of you being in a situation where the school's using biometrics is about 83 to 85%. So there's an awful lot of schools that are using biometrics, fingerprint biometrics. And just recently, within the past year and a half, facial recognition has started coming in for the same purposes, which is for paying for a school lunch. Pardon me. And we've also got a couple of private schools that are planning to use facial biometrics for door entry. So it's interesting because we are still bound under GDPR, and basically we updated as a country our Data Protection Act in 2018, which codifies the European General Data Protection Regulations, because we were leaving Europe, and so we needed to bring, it's a good piece of legislation, that bit of legislation across into UK law, and it explicitly says that kids' data is special category data, and they should be, any data collected should be completely minimised. Yeah. If there's a less data intrusive way of doing something, you take that route always, which is why biometrics shouldn't be in schools at all. And under GDPR, the regulators in France, Sweden and Bulgaria have all fined schools and stopped. And in Poland, the regulator there also stopped schools from using fingerprints. So we've got a good lot of case history with GDPR that really biometrics shouldn't be in schools at all. And it's really fortuitous that actually we've arranged this interview now, because we had a situation in North Ayrshire in Scotland in October 2021 where a company had offered facial recognition as a means to pay for school lunches, partly because they claimed it was quicker than a fingerprint, and obviously with COVID and hygiene reasons, it's more hygienic just to present your face at a scanner rather than present your fingerprint into a scanner. And so North Ayrshire Council, who the contract was with rather than the individual schools, have proceeded to sort of go ahead and start to use facial recognition on at least 2,500 pupils. And this came to light, and a journalist in the Financial Times ran an article in October 2021, and that sort of went a bit viral around the world because there wasn't anywhere else that was really using facial recognition apart from China. Yeah. For the purposes. There are some schools in the USA that have facial recognition that the industry claims makes schools safer, though they're very, very limited, and a handful of schools are doing it. It's not a great efficient technology in that sort of respect, only because the darker the skin tone you have, the less accurate it is. So it's biased. It's not a great technology, and this is so one of the problems with it. So last week, the Information Commissioner's office, which oversees our current Data Protection Act and GDPR, we were waiting on a ruling from them because they intervened with the North Ayrshire use of facial recognition in October 2021, and they halted the use of it and had a big investigation, which they came to a conclusion to in May last year. But they refused to publish the results. They wouldn't say whether or not North Ayrshire Council had breached GDPR and data protection, which they clearly, if you look at the previous rulings from regulators in Europe, they had. So we were waiting and sort of putting pressure on the I.C.O to say, look, is this, lawful? Have they broken the Data Protection Act, GDPR? And they eventually came out last week with a statement that the law was likely to have been breached. So, I mean, I've got it in front of me here. I can list those different articles of GDPR. So Article 5.1a, Article 6, Article 9, Article 12, which is all about lawful, fair and transparent data, the right to be informed, which is Article 13 of GDPR, retention of biometric data, Article 5.1e, And there was a problem with the data impact assessment. They were breaching data minimization, Article 5, and the data accuracy, again, in detail in Article 5. So there was a lot of likely breaches of data protection / GDPR. And so the next question then was, okay, well, what, as a regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, what are you going to do about it? I mean, this is, children are the most data, their data is gathered hugely in education, and not just in education, you know, sort of when they're on their internet usage and gaming use. So what are you going to do? And the answer has largely been nothing. It's all they've done is the Information Commissioner's Office have just said they're likely to have broken the law. Bye. So like, oh, so what do we do now? You know, obviously you've sort of given an opinion that the law, in quite detail, you know, I've listed a lot of points there that the Information Commissioner's Office have listed were likely to have been breached. You know, are you now writing a handbook for somebody that wants to use biometrics in schools? Like, you've got to, in your data protection impact assessment, go into detail more on law and fair and transparent communication, right to be informed, etc. So we're sort of, there's a few of us that are sort of working behind the scenes, again, another parent, some members of parliament, and another commissioner, not the Information Commissioner, that are looking at how we now go forwards with a non-ruling or a non-enforcement from a regulator that should be regulating data that clearly isn't regulating data. So
I'll stop you there for 1 minute, because obviously I want to still continue, but just a couple of things. So first of all, you talked about when this whole journey started for you, that a lot of the parents were from the tech industry that were like against this and so on and so forth. A couple of questions really. First of all, did you start getting more, I think you kind of answered in the last answer, did you start getting more and more parents who didn't really have the idea in regards to technology in schools come to you as the years went on and said, hang on a minute, this isn't great? I know you mentioned about primary school, but did that start happening from secondary school, more parents coming to you or contacting you about that? And also, I went last year, I went to a debate at the Battle of Ideas that was to do with biometrics. And one of the points I made, because one of the panels talked about how biometrics was being used as a way of counting kids in classes, I said, well, back in the day, there used to be a system that used to do that for you. They were called teachers, and they would read off a register. So what are the weird reasons have people given you, like schools giving you, as to why they need these biometrics? Because a lot of what they need it for could easily be done with the human eye. I don't understand why biometrics are used.
It was interesting because the companies that were selling biometrics to schools were selling the schools a solution to a problem that didn't exist, basically. It'll save you time. It'll free up your staff resources if a teacher's not taking registration, or you don't need a teaching assistant in a library to book kids in and out. There's no evidence whatsoever to say that saves time at all. And I've used Freedom of Information Acts extensively to ask schools, oh, you've got this technology, brand new technology, fingerprinting, facial recognition. What are you going to do with the extra 5 minutes of lunchtime a week? Are you going to extend the lesson time, run some more lunchtime clubs? And the answer is, it's never, ever been, oh yes, we've saved time and we've done this with it. So that's so I think it's, you know, also as well, data's more secure, there's less room for fraud. Well, you know, again, and I've used Freedom of Information Act to sort of ask schools, well, how much fraud was being committed in lunch queues? And they can't answer that. They can't say, oh, well, it went down from 2% to 0.1%, you know. And, you know, there's always going to be another thing, it stops bullying. Again, no evidence to suggest that using fingerprints stops bullying. I suppose it would perhaps stop bullying if somebody said, give me that 50p that you want to spend on a cookie, I want it. But, you know, you, as a society, we can't stop bullying. If bullying is happening, you address it. All using biometrics is going to do is push it somewhere else.
Yeah.
So there was no solution. It was just a technology, a new technology that I think schools thought was cool. And going back to your question on parents, yeah, I had a lot of parents contact me. Once I mean, my website was, my blog was up and running, people could sort of, it climbed its way up Google. And even now, if you type biometrics in schools, it'll be in the first 5, or if not the first 3, depending on how active I've been on it, results that you get, because there is no other website anywhere in the world other than a supplier that wants to sell this technology to a school that's dealing with biometrics in schools. So yeah, I had parents from all over the UK, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. I mean, not an awful lot, it has to be said, but I mean, I was getting, I don't know, 2 or 3 a month over, you know, which I suppose is quite a lot. And a lot of parents were concerned about it, but didn't know what to do. And I suppose after 2012, when the Protection of Freedoms Act came in, that question was answered, as in, you know, don't sign the consent form. You know, and the schools have to, by law, offer an alternative. So up to 2012, you know, all I could say is, you know, write to your MP, write to the local newspaper, you know, tell them about your experience with it, lend a hand with us and see if we can, you know, help out at all with the campaign to either get the technology kicked out of school or get the Data Protection Act changed. But during the course of that, I was started to get emails from the States, because I think it was in Illinois in the States, but that was about it. And there was one little piece of legislation in Illinois that basically had the same sort of consent we had. And but then, I think it's 2014. I don't even know how this happened, but anyway, in Florida, a travel company or a bus company that was taking kids to and from schools, thought it might be a good idea to iris scan kids getting on and off the bus to register that they were getting on and off the bus. So they did that, and accidentally forgot to tell the parents. I think there was about 900 kids that were involved in this particular school district. And there was a massive outcry. And the parents, most parents knew, were just like, oh, you know, what are you doing? And so very quickly, a senator there called Dorothy Hookhill, who's unfortunately passed away since then, very quickly wrote a bill, only a few pages long, to ban biometrics completely in all educational settings in Florida. The bill went through Parliament in a matter of months, and it was virtually unanimously agreed upon that no biometrics should be in any Floridian school. And I can't see any problem with the Florida school system being any worse off for not having any kids' biometrics in it. So interestingly enough, though, Florida did have a shooting a few years ago, I think in the Broward district, and they brought in a camera system which, rather than detect faces, had a system where if anybody was running where they shouldn't be running, or if an object was brought out or that looked like a gun, or there was a level of noise that shouldn't be there, that staff would be alerted to it. And I don't think I have a problem with that, because that's not actually identifying anybody. Nobody's data is being processed. It's just literally a camera saying there's a lot of movement here when there shouldn't be. And maybe in that situation, that would be helpful. And I think also as well, that sort of system, after you've had an event like that in a school district, probably really puts a lot of fears for parents and children at bay, and makes for, I wouldn't say a better school environment, but a less stressful school environment perhaps. So that's how Florida have used cameras in the way that other states wouldn't use it. Like in some other states, they're using, well, not actually in states, but in other schools in states, but it's very individual, where they're using facial recognition face for people coming in and out of entrances. So yeah, so that's quite interesting. But Florida is the only place, as far as I'm aware, worldwide that has legislation to ban biometrics in schools. But of course, the GDPR effectively bans biometrics in schools, as we've seen with, you know, the rulings in France, Sweden, Germany, and Poland, apart from England. So I had an online meeting just this morning with some people, sort of addressing the fact we've got an information commissioner that's refusing to enforce the law. And if they're refusing to enforce the law, does that mean that somebody is then picking and choosing which organisations are okay to use facial recognition or fingerprints and some organisations aren't. I think the problem we've got at the moment, and I don't speak about this in too much depth because I'm not involved in it, but as I understand, the Information Commissioner's Office is looking at online safety for children, which involves facial recognition. So if they say, well, facial recognition can't be used in schools, then what are they saying about facial recognition being used for online stuff in schools? And another point as well is that if they ruled that facial recognition in schools was likely to have broken different articles of data protection and GDPR, which it obviously has, otherwise they wouldn't have said is likely to have, they obviously deemed that it has, then suddenly the 83 to 85% of secondary schools that are running fingerprint systems presumably then have to stop running fingerprint systems, because in France, Sweden and Bulgaria, the data regulators there ruled against schools using facial recognition systems and fined them. And in Poland, their data regulator ruled against fingerprints. So we do have facial recognition and fingerprints being ruled out under GDPR, with all the schools receiving 5-figure, quite hefty fines in euros. But our data regulator has chosen not to do that, which we're unclear about. Pardon me. And certainly those are questions that we would like to be seen raised in Parliament to the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, who currently oversees the I.C.O, or the I.C.O comes under their umbrella. So that's where we're hoping to sort of trying to understand why the I.C.O hasn't enforced it, whose decision that was, and why they decided not to enforce it. So that's where we're currently at the moment.
Okay, so just going back a little bit, because you talked about the shooting in Florida, and then they brought in the technology to recognise someone's cadence of holding an object if they're in danger. And initially, correct me if I'm wrong, but you said you didn't necessarily see an issue with that based on what the event that happened before. Well, it wasn't you can understand why like parents might go for that. Is that correct, or have I got that completely wrong?
No, you've got that correct.
The reason I'm asking is because I'm just wondering, wouldn't a problem with that be that in a sense you're almost making people guilty before they can be found innocent just based on particular movements? Because I know from the human eye, like for example, you see people walking down the road, and I think this is happening in shooting in America, where they have an object in their hand and police fire, and it turns out to be a phone and whatnot. So isn't that an issue with regards to the way biometrics works? With something like that, you're making someone guilty before they're found innocent. And to add on to that as well, correct me if I'm wrong, but before the Protection of Freedoms Act came out in 2012, isn't it the case that if a school stored someone's biometrics, i.e. a fingerprint in their database, because there's no protections covered by Data Protection Act, an officer could come into the school and request those fingerprints? Or have I got that completely wrong?
No, you've not got that completely wrong at all. Going back to the Florida situation, I find it difficult to speak on that, because if my kids were in a school where that type of technology could alert somebody, I would probably feel happy, from a parental point of view.
Yeah.
If you've got something that's not data intrusive, but also as well, if the kids are aware that if they do run or take something, I'm sure they wouldn't get shot at in school, but that it sort of makes them aware. It's a different culture over there I think, with regards to what happens with these events. So I find it difficult to sort of comment on, though as a parent, I think, it's difficult, isn't it? It's difficult. And I think we've all got that different level of privacy. Some parents are completely fine with their kids being fingerprinted and facially recognised. Fine. Some parents aren't. And the point was that I was having that choice taken away from me. Yeah. And I am not telling people what to do. I think, if you are happy with that level of privacy, fine. Some people switch their lights on at night and sit there with the curtains open. Quite happy for people to look in their living room. I don't. I close my curtains. Everybody's got different levels. And I think when we're going back to Florida, I think I think there's a trade-off between, you know, I mean, there's no evidence as far as I know. I don't know, but as far as I know, I mean, I'm not doing much research on it, whether or not these types of systems have stopped anything. I mean, they might have stopped, you know, smaller events of violence happening in schools, or, you know, if something was, I don't know, I can't comment. But it's a step. I don't know. It's just
that's fine.
it's a difficult one, really. But as far as access to school databases, and this is interesting because I sent the police freedom of information, all the police forces in the UK, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Northern Ireland, freedom of information requests in 2013 and in 2021. That's it. Yeah, 2013 and 2021, on whether or not they'd ever accessed a school fingerprint database. So before we're talking about, just let's clarify what a school fingerprint database is. It's not a database of fingerprints. There's no photographs of fingerprints. So what the system does is, if you present with a fingerprint, it will read the salient points, like the whoops and the swirls, and make salient points and sort of have a dot-to-dot map of your finger, which then translates into maybe a 40-digit number string. So every time you present your finger at a scanner, so for example, so when children initially register on a system, they present their thumb or their finger 3 times, because every time you present it, you might present it slightly different angle, might be a bit of dirt on your finger. So you get a sort of an average algorithm for your fingerprint. So every time you go back to the scanner, it scans the whole system of thousands of algorithms and picks out the algorithm that's yours, or is within a 97% accuracy that it's yours, because, you know, I presented it a different way. So when you're transferring fingerprint data from agency to agency, all you're doing is transferring a number string or a data string. So in, gosh, I think I'm going to say the 1990s, this fingerprint data became a problem because different states were recording fingerprints in different ways. There wasn't a universal fingerprint database, probably as there is now. So when a felon went over the state boundary, it was a different system. So the authorities there built systems that would be interoperable. So you could transfer data and it would then assimilate itself onto, you know, the next state's database. So transferring fingerprint data between different databases is not a problem. It's not been a problem for the past 30 years. And it certainly won't be a problem now as much as it was 30 years ago. And fingerprint data is shared across the EU, and we do share with different countries around the world. Obviously, if you've got somebody traveling from country to country that's person of interest, fingerprint data. So why would the police not be using fingerprint data from school databases to help solve the crime if they thought they could do so? And the question that is, well, they can do that and not tell the parent or the child that they've got that information, or that they've asked the school, and the school doesn't have to tell the parent or child either, because it's for the purposes of solving a crime. So I put freedom of information requests to every police force in the UK in 2013, and I'll just bring up the information on that. Just 1 minute, hang on, police access, here we go. So there was 48 UK police forces at the time, and basically there's a get out clause in the Freedom of Information Act, I think it's section 12, which says if it costs over £650 or X amount of hours to answer the freedom of information request, we can decline because it's too expensive. As a public authority, you know, they don't be spending hours and hours and hours on these things. So 79% of the forces said it's going to cost too much, we can't tell you. 8% of the forces failed to answer the request, and another 8% of the forces said they had not accessed. 2 forces said they had no information. So basically, over 80% of the forces just said we can't give you that. We're going to refuse to give it you because of cost. And I thought, well, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if out of all the police forces in the UK, not one has accessed a school database. And this was in 2013. The technology had been in schools for 13 years at that point. So you're not telling me that in the past decade, plus you've never accessed a school database, and they were declining that. I mean, but if they'd have said, yes, we have, then that would have made massive headline news that the police were dipping into school fingerprint databases. And if they said, no, we haven't, then obviously another question would be, well, why the hell not? I mean, you've got, how many crimes have you got that are unsolved that you could possibly solve? Even now, sort of, if you've been fingerprinting kids for the past 10 years, and schools don't always erase data when kids leave. I've had this from pupils that are now adults that have, you know, older siblings of kids that are still at high school, secondary school, they've gone back in, put their fingerprints on a scan, and their data's still been there. And, you know, even though data might have been deleted from a system, it doesn't mean to say it's completely destroyed. You know, when you delete something, you might only alter the first digit of the number string, and quite a lot of the information of that individual is still there. So they were sort of damned, the police forces were damned if they'd said yes and damned if they said no. And this sort of 85+% of the police forces coming back with a refusal to answer was quite interesting. So I asked the same question in 2021 for this report that we did last year on the 10-year anniversary of sort of biometrics in schools with the Protection of Freedoms Act. And it sort of came, there was a lot of police, I haven't got the results in front of me, but basically the answer was no, they haven't. Quite a lot of them said it would cost too much money. Quite a few more had said categorically, no, we haven't. Interestingly enough, because now a school biometric isn't just a fingerprint, it's a photograph. And the facial recognition systems that are being used in schools are capable of and can use the school information management's photograph, which is the photograph that everybody gets taken when they go to school. That SIMS, School Information Management Systems photograph, is classed as a biometric. And so I'd included in my latest round of freedom of information requests to not just, I say, have you taken fingerprints, but have you taken photographs? And one police force had, one of the Welsh police forces, I think it was South Wales, and said, yeah, we have taken a photograph from the school database. For whatever purposes, they didn't enlighten me, but we are now have instances of biometrics, a potential biometric anyway, a school photograph being slid from a school information management systems database across to a police database. And I don't know whether that particular child and their parents knew that had happened. I don't know what it was for, but again, it came back with a no for fingerprints. But certainly, I think every single child who has a photograph taken at school, which they all do, you've got to consider that's a potential biometric that can be slid across. So that sort of creates a whole different conversation on, really, should schools be asking for permission under the Protection of Freedoms Act to take school photos? And I know that parents have to sign a permission slip to say it's okay for schools to take photos of children, I think. I mean, I don't know if my children have now left school. But I think definitely now that photograph can be used for multiple uses, so not just as a system identifying, you know, for one human to say, yes, that's little Johnny or whatever, but it then can be used into a biometric template for a facial recognition system. I think really parents should be signing permission slips that details, you know, the Protection of Freedoms Act, and, you know, this is what could be being used for, because certainly the facial recognition system that was rolled out in Scotland, the system there had a potential to use the school's information management database of photographs. As far as I can understand, the catering company actually went in and took separate photographs, but when it was trialled in a school in Gateshead, secondary school in Gateshead, they were pulling across the school information management photographs, so they didn't have to go through the whole process of photographing 1,000 kids again. So they did use those school photographs. So now under data protection, that's a change of use of data. So when you collect data, if the reason for it changes, or the reason how you're going to use it changes, then you have to notify the data subjects, yeah, which would be the parents. And as far as I'm aware, that didn't happen. So there's a whole grey area really with how facial recognition is going to go in schools, especially with the Information Commissioner refusing to do his job and regulate when it has happened, when they think there's likely been a breach of legislations.
That's just crazy. I mean, one of the questions as I was as I was hearing what you were saying, I was formulating is, because obviously you say, unlike say Florida, biometrics in schools isn't banned in England. And I was just wondering, in terms of the companies that offer these biometric services, is there anything in the Protection of Freedoms Act that helps regulate them? Like they have to reach a certain level of duty of care? Not at all. Not at all. Oh gosh.
The government has no idea who is supplying schools with biometric systems. They don't know the companies. They don't know what biometrics are being used in schools. As far as I'm aware, and I've got this information through Freedom of Information requests, the government, the Department of Education, has never seen any hardware or software. And initially, when the library systems were being used in the UK for primary schools, this was ex-Guantanamo Bay fingerprint systems from a company called Digital Persona. It's ex-military. Yeah. And the recent case we've got at the moment with the facial recognition being supplied for catering purposes, there's only one company that's doing it, called CRB Cunningham's, and they state, or they have stated, because they removed it from their website, that, now let me get this right because I don't want to put myself into anything litigious here. I have got it written down. Okay, yeah, so quotation marks. They had a webinar that was featuring this brand new facial recognition technology, and quite a lot of comments from the school or the establishments where they were trialing it, because Cunningham's were giving this facial recognition technology away for free. Now, you don't, if it's got a commercial value and it's been thoroughly tested, you charge for it, and it just raises alarm bells when they're gifting this technology to schools. And so one of the questions schools had was, how will it cope with the changing faces of young children? You know, you've got somebody coming in at year 7, leaving at potentially year 13. So you've got sort of 11 to 18-year-old. We have a lot of changes that happens in our faces in that time. So let me just take a drink of water.
Sure, carry on.
I do a lot of talking. Okay. Yeah. They state that the point of sale system, which is where the kids present at the cash till, basically present their faces for payment, it says updated every 3 months. So every 3 months, the system takes a new photograph of the child that compares it and updates it. They also state that the algorithm grows with the child. So there's a learning algorithm. The system constantly evolves the algorithm. And so I'm just going to say that, I'm quoting that from a webinar video that they had online until they took it offline. But anyway, it's now on YouTube, courtesy of me. So if you do want to go and watch that full webinar, it's about half an hour long. And if you type in facial recognition school Cunningham's, you'll find that as a YouTube video. I checked it recently, I presume it's still up there. But that's where they state that the algorithms growing with the child, the system constantly evolves, and they're taking, you know, face templates, photographs every 3 months to teach their algorithm how to cope with a changing face. Now, I've had a look on the internet. I mean, I have scoured the internet, and I can't find any facial recognition technology that's being sold at the moment that can do that, which is why they've not really had facial technology systems in schools, because face changes, unlike your fingerprint. So that's why, but now we've got to the point, in fact, if you do search for many different variations of facial technology, children learning algorithm, changing faces of children, you know, every different combination you can to try and pull up where you might find more of this. data. There really only is university research papers on it, and those have only been as recent as 2019, 2018, 2021. So universities are writing about how to tackle this problem of changing faces. There's nowhere, unless anybody can tell me, where this evolving learning algorithm is being used. And that was one of the questions that I asked the Information Commissioner's Office, because when they were investigating North Ayrshire Council's use of the technology, I sort of said, the company is stating that this is learning, evolving technology. If it is, where else is it being used? Or, you know, have we got other circumstances, other schools, maybe in other countries? Where's it come from? Because I certainly can't find it anywhere. And the Information Commissioner's response to my Freedom of Information request was, well, we've asked North Ayrshire Council, and the council tells us, that the company tells us, it doesn't learn. But the company says on its website that it does. And how, if it doesn't learn, then you've got a technology that's never been able to be used in schools before because the faces change. So it obviously has to learn, otherwise it wouldn't be a viable technology to be used in schools. So there's a whole lot of grey area that, yeah, it's not been fully exhausted, I feel.
So you talked about universities and the research they've done. It's only really be prominent in 2019.
Yeah, not, you know, I can't find any research or papers that go back any more than 4 years on this type of technology, bearing in mind that Cunningham's put this technology into Kings Meadow School in Gateshead in 2020. So there's been one school that's had this technology since 2020. And it's for me, one of the if you do search for, you know, trying to find this learning technology with children, I think the Australian government only went out to tender about 3 years ago, asking for companies to come up with this type of technology, because they wanted to use it for military purposes. I mean, if different military departments haven't got this type of learning technology, or are going out to tender for it, or asking somebody to develop it, this is the Australian military, what's it doing in a UK high school? I mean, all I can assume, and this is completely my opinion, I'm not stating it as fact, is that, well, let's just look at the facts. It seems, from what I can gather from Freedom of Information requests, that this technology is being given free of charge to schools and local authorities to use. I can't find any example of it being used anywhere else in the world. I mean, anywhere. The question has to be asked, are our school children being used to teach the algorithm how to work? Don't know.
I mean, not to get a conspiracy theories, but I was thinking the same of universities, in the sense of, is part of the reason why they've not done any research on this, and again, this is just a thought out there, is what's the level of biometrics being used in universities? Because I'm wondering, if you're using quite a bit of biometrics at university campuses, would it be actually advantageous for universities to actually do some more research on it in case something does turn up, or maybe it might be a positive, I don't know, but I'm just wondering about that relationship as well.
I don't know the level of biometrics that are used in universities. I know they are being used in universities for attendance and for canteen use. I think one of the reasons why I've not got involved in university uses of biometrics is because after the age of 18, you're sort of an adult and it's up to you, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
You know, there's not that sort of level of protection that certainly I initially felt for my 6 and 7-year-old kids, my kids sort of being told to put the fingerprints on a scanner without letting me know about it, and them not being in a situation where they would know any different not to do it. So I don't know. I mean, like I say, there's a lot of grey area as to where this technology has come from, because certainly CRB Cunningham's are not a research and development biometric company. They are a cashless point of sale till company that have collectively, CRB Cunningham's is a mixture of two companies that sort of got merged about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, that were very prominent in that point of sale area for at least a few decades. So it's a really well established company of point of sale to all sorts of catering and industries, and they just happen to have got into schools and happen to have used biometrics, and the biometric technology they used won't have been the technology that they've got labs and created. They'll have bought that or leased that or whatever from someone else. So yeah, it's not the first time that we've used UK school children to test a technology. Just let me go on my website now, because I just want to be accurate with dates. So here it is. So in 2006, Fujitsu worked with AMY, which is AMEY. So AMY has the one of the largest contracts to supply education to Scotland and areas of Glasgow. It's one of the biggest, I think, PPI or PFI contract in Europe. And they partnered with Fujitsu to introduce infrared palm scanning to a primary school in, say, Todd Home Primary School in Paisley. So this was in 2006. And this was, palm scanning again. You could go on the internet in 2006, nobody's palm scanning anybody infrared, and there's certainly no products on the market. So why have we got infrared palm scanning in a primary school in Scotland? It's got Fujitsu were basically trialing it. That particular palm scanner went to market in September 2016. So it took them 10 years, and they basically tested it on primary school children in Scotland. So we do have form as a country letting companies into our schools to research and development biometric products. So it wouldn't surprise me again in Scotland if something similar had happened here. I'm not saying it has happened. I don't think the I.C.O has done a thorough enough investigation to answer my question, certainly, on whether or not that's happened, which is highly questionable or on ethical grounds, I think, to be using a few thousand kids to develop an algorithm for a commercial company on facial recognition.
Yeah.
If that's what's happening.
Yeah, highly illegal, unethical, just very dubious all around.
Well, it's questions that I've asked the Information Commissioner's Office, and I also asked North Ayrshire Council, and nobody's answered my queries with this. I mean, all I'm doing is sort of asking, because I can't ask the private company that's supplying the facial recognition, because they're not obliged to answer under freedom of information. They're a private company, it's commercial stuff. All I can do is use freedom of information on publicly funded bodies like the I.C.O, Information Commissioner's Office, and North Ayrshire Council. And I either don't seem to know, haven't investigated it, or they've asked Cunningham's, and Cunningham's, according to certainly North Ayrshire Council, said, no, there's no learning algorithms, when their website and their webinar aimed at schools states completely differently, as I've just quoted to you. So if it was just a question of we're using facial recognition, there's definitely an easier way to do this without being so data intensive. Let's comply to GDPR, get rid of biometrics, use a chip and pin, use a pin, use a swipe card. But you don't need to give that level of personal information to get a bag of chips, basically. So that's one issue in itself that should be addressed and has been addressed in Europe, not in the UK, even though we have the same GDPR. And then you've got this whole other area of, well, actually, what technology are we using in schools? Because the Department of Education has no clue. Information Commissioner clearly has no clue, because I've asked them and they just taken North Ayrshire Council's word for it. North Ayrshire Council haven't done their due diligent research because they're just believing what the company tells them, which is fair enough. And I suppose you would believe what the company, why would you do some more research? But I don't think there's anyone really asking question. I mean, one of the first questions I would ask if I was having this technology in my school is, okay, where's the case study? Can you show me where else this technology is so I can see if it works?
Mhm.
I'm not going to take your word for it because, you know, you're trying to sell me a product. I want to see if this product works. So where else is it? And if they're saying, well, it's the only school, other school it's in is this school in Gateshead, which we put it in last year. And it's, I would then sort of say, well, hang on, you know, we've got 11,000 kids using this system. This is obviously potentially a huge spend. Show me where else it's being used, and show me that it's not biased to people of darker skin color. Show me what the false positive and false negative rates are. And they can't do it. So why would you go down that route? Why would you not? It's just, I mean, maybe I'm finding it difficult to understand because, you know, I have a problem. I don't have a problem. You know, I don't, if people want to use it, fine, fair enough. But I think there's a profit to be made, I think, not in just monetary terms, but in data terms. Yeah. Not from North Ayrshire Council or the I.C.O, but I think there are other third parties that can profit from this. And that is not ethical at all, using children in that way, if that's what's happening. But nobody is telling me it's not happening. And it's happened before.
So isn't there anything in the Protection of Freedoms Act, just linking onto that would talk about proportionality? Because from what you're saying, even the use of biometrics really is disproportionate. So wasn't that established in the Protection of Freedoms Act, or even in another law, in regards to, okay, you can use it, but it has to be proportionate to what the reason you're using it for? Because at the moment, it doesn't seem the case.
No, you actually hit the nail on the head. The Protection of Freedoms Act only deals with consent. So this is, like I said to you, one parent consents, the other one doesn't, The Data Protection Act, stroke GDPR, deals with proportionality. And it absolutely says in both of those pieces of legislation that if a less data intrusive way is possible, you must always take that way with children, minors, special category data is biometrics, and you shouldn't use it. And that's why France, Sweden, Poland and Bulgaria have all absolutely jumped on schools that are using any type of biometric facial recognition or fingerprint and fined them, you know, in excess of €20,000. I mean, that's a fairly hefty fine. So, and we haven't done that. So, yeah, there is legislation. It's just, it's funny, our regulator has chosen not to enforce it for some reason, which is why we had a little bit of a meeting this morning to try and find out why he hasn't enforced it, really. And if we've got a regulator that's picking and choosing or making the law subjective rather than objective, then that's not good. You know, a lot of people worked a long time on those laws. You know, I worked on the Protection of Freedoms Act with the committee, did quite a bit of work on that. You know, there's a lot of work that goes into drafting these legislations, and if they're not worth the paper they're written on, that's worrying, because if that's happening at the Information Commissioner's office, is it happening elsewhere in government? We probably know that it is. But, you know, especially with kids' data, you know, adults' data, you know, we've got an expiry date that's not that far away. You know, you're talking about a 10-year-old's biometric data. It's got to be secure for perhaps 80 years, 70 years. You know, if anything, the Information Commission should be all over this like a rash, and not just with facial recognition, with fingerprints. And of course, you know, and it doesn't take long to convert a fingerprint system onto a cashless payment system, sort of with a swipe card or a PIN. And in fact, quite a lot of the companies supplying biometrics to schools for catering purposes during COVID sort of said, oh, you know, you're not happy using a fingerprint scanner because of the potential of transmission through, you know, 1,000 kids touching one scanner or two scanners. We can convert like this back to, and again, in the same webinar, Cunningham's had said, yeah, you know, we converted X amount of thousands of kids back onto cashless catering, onto swipe cards. It's easy, and really schools should always have those two systems in place, because no school has a 100% take up really of biometrics, and they should always offer an alternative. So schools already have those alternatives in place. So if the I.C.O was to say, okay, so it's not lawful or legal to use fingerprints or facial recognition in schools, it would be no biggie for schools just to quickly, within a week or two, transfer over onto a non-biometric system.
Yeah. So you mentioned the C word there, and for the purposes of algorithm for YouTube, I'll call it the last 2 years unspecified virus of unknown origin, right? So we'll call it that for the time being. I've only just started it. I don't want to get strike ready, but we're recording this interview on February the 7th. This will go out hopefully the end of March. The reason I say that is because obviously the news came, last couple of weeks regarding this 70th Brigade and the spying that went on during the pandemic. Obviously, I've heard about that, but was there anything related to the biometrics relation to that? So for those who don't know, basically, government were looking into people who were disagreeing with the direction, basically what the information that was out there, or disagreeing with it, and those people are being spied on, in layman's terms. So in regards to that, do you know of anything that took place regarding biometrics or something during the pandemic at all?
No, not with certainly in regards to my field of biometrics, sort of to do with schools. And all I can say is that some schools, or quite a few schools, decided not to use biometrics because of the potential contamination of a fingerprint scanner. I don't know how, when the COVID pass or the digital ID sort of comes up, I always get a bit of sort of prickly feeling, because certainly when we were campaigning against schools using biometrics in the early 2000s, No2ID were a fantastic help. And No2ID were an organisation back then that were fighting the introduction of national biometric ID cards that Tony Blair wanted to bring in. And they sort of said they saw this introduction of fingerprinting and facial recognition or whatever in schools as a way of softening up the next generation to make a digital ID, or, that they were fighting at the time, 20 years ago, make the next generation more compliant. And I'm inclined to agree with that. Lots of younger people open their phones with their faces or their fingerprints, or and don't question it. And I suppose if you're in a peace-loving democracy, that's fine. But as soon as that change of leadership happens, it's not fine. And a good example of this is when the Americans left Afghanistan. They quickly exited, and then also nicely left the Taliban all the biometric databases of the population and people that were on their systems that helped them.
Oh.
I know.
Yeah, that's.
So you've got to be really careful when you're talking, where does it go? How long is it retained for? Where's it gone? Who's using it for what? Like school photograph, just a school photograph. Now a potential biometric that's being transferred to police for whatever reason. So,
I mean, you talk about softening up kids. Now, as I said, we met 10 years ago in a pub and this room, and one of the images you showed me relating to softening up, which shocked me, was what you call the eye patty. Can you just explain that and how it's softening up people? Because when I saw it, I was like, oh my goodness gracious me. I was stunned by it, to say the least.
Yeah, this is, so you have, is this the RFID that we're talking about, sort of?
Yeah.
So, oh dear, I mean, I'm sort of interested in the use of RFID in schools, which is radio frequency identification, because when I was first doing some research on where schools were using fingerprint systems, I initially thought they've got to be using them in the States, and they weren't actually. But what they were doing in one school was using putting RFID tags around pupils' necks so they could see where they were. And as they went into classrooms, the RFID would go, presumably talk to a reader and tell the reader that somebody was in a classroom. And that really didn't catch on for an awful lot of reasons. I'm sure everybody's, it was very sort of sinister, very dystopian. You could track kids wherever they were. And so my interest in RFID sort of flared up there. So I thought, I wonder, I wonder if that's happening in the UK. And it wasn't at the time. But it did sort of spark my interest on how you can be monitored by radio frequency devices. And it's crazy, because it's like, we've got the technology and we could use it for this, but no, we shouldn't really be using it to monitor how babies go to the toilet. You can buy baby grows with monitors on them, telling you when the baby's, what the baby's heart rate is, when it's awake, when it's asleep, a bit too much information. And I think sometimes, I was just talking about this morning in a meeting that we had, and I think you sort of said it as well earlier, maybe, if you use technology like this, like biometrics for school canteens or registration, or RFID tags on kids, and that you sort of dehumanize the school experience. I mean, if you've got a teacher that's shouting out people's names, there's generally possibly an eye contact where you can sort of think, oh gosh, she doesn't look very well today, or they look like they've been crying. Whereas if you've not got that initial contact, that hello, yes, I'm here, miss, then you're missing that. Kids just walk in, teacher's there, teachers can see on a computer screen who's in the classroom. You've not made that eye-to-eye contact. You've not started the day with, hi, how are you, And, with canteen staff as well. And I suppose you could see it through reports that would be generated through the school catering system. But, you might find that if there's somebody on a till, that they would sort of look at little Johnny or Lucy or whatever and think, oh, they're not eating what they normally eat. And the system might flag that up, but a human being might see it better. I might see that goes along with them looking like they've been crying, or do you know what I mean? And I think when you're using technology to supposedly make the school infrastructure run smoothly, then we're sort of taking something away from the community of the school, the family of the school, that human contact that's just we all need. And I think that's a really important point to make with this technology. Yes, it might make things slightly more secure. It might speed the lunch line up by a second a child on average over, I don't know. There's been no proof, so I can't say it does or it doesn't. But what we are sacrificing is that human contact, and I think especially when most people, including myself, spend a lot of time gazing at a screen like I am now. So nice to have that face-to-face eye contact.
Yeah.
So human. And we're teaching our kids by using and streamlining the schools with this sort of technology that hopefully won't have an effect on their generation, their kids. If they're desensitized and dehumanized a little bit by that as a child, how will they pass on that to the next generation? And then, I just think there's a bigger discussion to be had around this type of technology, just in general, apart from the ins and outs and ethics and who's making money and where it's come from, whether it's ex-military or whatever. I just think, these are kids. I just think, just let them be kids, let them grow up in a humane way, I think.
Okay, cool. And on that note, we'll leave the interview there on a real nice positive note. Thank you very much again for agreeing to do this. It's really is much appreciated. In regards to your work, if say a parent has any concerns regarding biometrics, where would you advise them to look for information? Obviously, you've got your blog spot as well, which we'll put in the description when this video is on YouTube. But also, where else could they look and what else could they do in regards to any biometric data, both for their children and for themselves as adults?
Great question, thanks. So my website is pippaking.blogspot.com, or if you just do a search, any search engine of biometrics in schools. I did a TED talk on this in 2019, so you can do a search for me on YouTube, that would come up.
I'll post it in the description as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm also on Twitter, which is at Pippa_King, or again, if you search for biometrics in schools, you'll find me on there. There's only one of me. There's nobody else that really has got a site or a Twitter or social media that's specifically to that. And I think if parents are concerned, then certainly opt out of any biometric system. The schools, if you're in England and Wales, should be giving you that by law anyway. And if they're not, then search Protection of Freedoms Act, biometric consent. You'll get the parts of the act that the schools are obliged to ask you under. If you're in Scotland or Northern Ireland, again, schools out of courtesy should be asking you. They generally do, and you generally have an option to opt out. Although a lot of schools frame it as a fait accompli, as in fact, we've got a biometric fingerprint scanner, sign here. Not telling you there's an option for another thing to do, which actually then isn't consent because they haven't gained full consent. So, but yeah, I mean, if in doubt, just say no. And I think have that conversation with your child as well, because quite often as parents sort of say, oh, we've said no, but you know, little Johnny feels like he's being the odd one out. I just have a conversation with him and say, you know, this is your most personal data that can never ever be, you know, once it's gone, it's gone. You know, that's your most personal data and it's you. And I think in this age of us teaching kids to, you know, my body, my choice sort of thing, this is if they're just using their face or their fingertip to pay for a bag of chips, really, you know, it's that's not what your body's there for. Your body is there for many wonderful reasons, and it's certainly not to buy a bag of chips. So I think it's not the question of parents saying no, it's maybe just having that conversation with the next generation to understand why you said no and to make them rethink, and hopefully then they might have that conversation with their friends. And certainly this is all anecdotal, but I will just leave it with you. The Protection of Freedoms Act is the only piece of legislation that enables kids to say no to something in school where the legislation and the law is behind them. Everything else they are compelled to do in school, apart from this one thing. This is the only piece of legislation a child has got, whether they be 4 years old or 16-year-old, in school, where if the school tells them to do something, they can legally say no, and the school can't do anything about it. There were a section of kids in one of the London boroughs that cottoned on to this. And I think if I was at secondary school and I had a chance to tell the school no, and that was the only piece of legislation I could do it under, I think out of sheer teenagerness or whatever it would be, I would just probably say no anyway. And it's interesting because that group of kids in London were sort of highlighted that was their right by another bunch of kids up in the north. And so the kids are starting to think, oh, hang on a minute, we've actually got a piece of legislation that's in our favour. And for whatever reason, you know, whether you want to be a pain to the school or whether you actually do care about your data, we're now starting to see the kids cotton onto it a bit, which is great. And it's there for kids, you know, it's there to protect their data, and it should have no effect on them if they don't use their biometric. They'll just get given a different way to do it. So yeah, it's all, you know, I think as much as you can sort of think we're walking into this dystopian future with the different types of biometrics and that, the awareness of it is growing, and the awareness of why we shouldn't be doing it is growing as well. And certainly that awareness is in GDPR and data protection and sort of spread to other European countries, but not to us yet, but it will do, I'm sure.
All right, cool. And on that note, end the interview. Again, Pippa, thank you so much for being willing to be interviewed for this podcast. It is really greatly appreciated.
Thank you for having me. It's been good to talk.
Good. And for everyone else who's watching, if you've liked what you've heard, can you please like this interview on YouTube, Apple, Spotify? Can you please subscribe as well to the channel? It will really help the channel to grow. I have great things I want to do with this channel, but at the first incremental step. So if you could just please subscribe and then share this interview around, that'd be great. Thank you very much for those who have listened to this interview, and I'll see you again soon. Take care.